Hi, I'm Chloe. 3 months ago, I woke up in an ICU bed with doctors telling me I was lucky to be alive. The last thing I remembered was drinking my morning coffee at my father's house, and then everything went black. What I discovered next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family and lead me down a path I never imagined I'd have to walk. Today, Victoria is facing federal charges. My father lost his insurance license, and I'm finally free from a house that was slowly killing me. Literally. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in my father's house on Maple Avenue in the Hillsdale district of Portland. Rain drummed against the kitchen windows, creating that familiar Pacific Northwest symphony that had been the soundtrack to my life for the past 3 years. I shuffled downstairs in my oversized university sweatshirt and fuzzy slippers, already running late for my morning shift at Grind Coffee House downtown. My hair was still damp from the shower, and I could smell Victoria's expensive perfume lingering in the hallway, which meant she was already awake, and probably in her home office, preparing for another day of what she called managing household investments. The kitchen felt unusually quiet. Normally, Dylan would be sprawling across the breakfast bar with his cereal, complaining about some teacher or asking to borrow money for lunch. My half-brother was 16 and had inherited our father's ability to fill any space with noise, whether it was his laugh, his music, or his endless questions about everything from sports to girls, to whether I thought he should grow his hair out. But this morning, the house held that particular kind of silence that makes you notice the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock. I grabbed my favorite mug from the cabinet, the one with the faded university logo that Victoria always said looked cheap, but that I'd been using since my sophomore year. It was one of the few things I'd brought from my old apartment when I moved back in with Dad after graduation. The job market had been brutal, and student loans were breathing down my neck like a persistent debt collector. Moving back home was supposed to be temporary, just until I could save enough to get back on my feet. That was 11 months ago. The coffee maker was already brewing, steam rising from the carafe in lazy spirals. Victoria always made coffee early, claiming it helped her think clearly for her morning routine of checking investment portfolios and planning what she called household optimization strategies. She had this whole system for everything, from color-coding the family calendar to organizing the pantry by expiration dates. It was the kind of precision that impressed my father and made me feel like I was constantly disrupting some invisible order just by existing in the space. I poured the coffee into my mug, watching the dark liquid swirl as I added a splash of the vanilla creamer I kept hidden behind the orange juice. Victoria preferred black coffee and had made several pointed comments about how flavored creamers were unnecessary expenses and gateway drugs to poor dietary habits. I'd learned to pick my battles in this house, and vanilla creamer was one of the small rebellions I wasn't willing to give up. The first sip tasted different. Not dramatically different, but there was something underneath the familiar bitterness that made me pause. A chemical tang that didn't belong, like when you accidentally bite your tongue after brushing your teeth. I frowned and took another sip, thinking maybe the creamer had gone bad, or that Victoria had switched coffee brands without mentioning it. She was always making small changes to save money, or because she'd read some article about optimizing household efficiency. By the third sip, my stomach started to feel strange. Not nauseous exactly, but like something was shifting inside me, rearranging itself in ways that didn't feel right. I set the mug down on the granite countertop and pressed my hand to my abdomen, thinking maybe I was coming down with something. The flu had been going around my workplace, and I'd been pulling extra shifts to cover for sick coworkers. The kitchen began to tilt slightly, as if the house was on a boat that had just hit an unexpected wave. I gripped the edge of the counter, blinking hard to clear my vision. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed too bright, casting harsh shadows that moved in ways that didn't match the swaying of the tree branches outside. My heart started racing, beating so fast I could hear it in my ears like a drum that had lost its rhythm. "Victoria," I called out, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Victoria, I think something's wrong." No answer. The house remained wrapped in that unnatural quiet, broken only by the sound of my own increasingly labored breathing. I tried to walk toward the living room, but my legs felt like they were made of water, unsteady and unreliable. Each step required tremendous concentration, as if I was learning to walk all over again. The walls seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in slow, hypnotic waves. I knew this wasn't normal, knew something was seriously wrong, but my thoughts moved like honey, thick and slow and hard to grasp. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the screen. The numbers on the keypad swam in front of my eyes, refusing to hold still long enough for me to dial. Dad, I called out, louder this time, though it felt like shouting into a tunnel. Dad, I need help. Footsteps on the stairs, quick and light. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing one of her crisp white blouses and dark slacks that made her look like she was heading to a business meeting rather than spending the day at home. Her expression was calm, almost serene, which seemed wrong given that I was clearly in distress. Chloe, honey, what's the matter? She asked, but there was something in her tone that didn't match the words. A detachment, like she was asking about the weather, rather than responding to someone who was obviously having a medical emergency. I don't feel right, I managed to say, the words coming out slurred, despite my efforts to speak clearly. Something's wrong with the coffee. I think I need to go to the hospital. Victoria moved closer, her heels clicking against the tile floor with measured precision. You look a little pale, she said, reaching out to touch my forehead with the back of her hand. Her skin was cool and dry, and she smelled like her usual perfume mixed with something else, something sharp and clean that reminded me of a doctor's office. Maybe you should sit down, she suggested, guiding me toward one of the breakfast bar stools. You've been working so many extra shifts lately. You're probably just exhausted. I wanted to argue, wanted to explain that this felt nothing like exhaustion, but the room was spinning faster now, and keeping my eyes open required more energy than I seemed to have. Victoria's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted. She was saying something about calling Dad, about how I'd been under so much stress lately, about how young people today didn't know how to take care of themselves properly. The last thing I remembered was the pattern on the kitchen floor, those tiny black and white tiles that Victoria had insisted on when they remodeled the year before I moved in. They seemed to be moving, shifting like puzzle pieces, trying to rearrange themselves into a picture I couldn't quite make out. Then everything went dark, and I fell into a silence so complete it felt like drowning in reverse. When I woke up, the world was white and sterile, and filled with the steady beeping of machines I couldn't see. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming, and there was a tube down my nose that made breathing feel mechanical and strange. The fluorescent lights above me were too bright, creating halos that hurt to look at directly. Every muscle in my body ached, as if I'd run a marathon in my sleep. A woman in scrubs was checking something on a monitor next to my bed. She had kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and when she noticed I was awake, her face broke into a gentle smile that somehow made me want to cry. Welcome back, she said softly, adjusting something on the IV line that ran into my left arm. I'm Dr. Patterson. You're at OHSU Hospital. You've been unconscious for about 6 hours. 6 hours. The words didn't make sense at first. I remembered drinking coffee in the kitchen, remembered feeling strange, remembered Victoria's cool hand on my forehead. But 6 hours felt like a lifetime, a gap in my memory that left me feeling unmoored and confused. What happened to me? I asked though, speaking was difficult with whatever was in my throat. Dr. Patterson pulled up a chair next to my bed, her expression growing serious. You were brought in with symptoms of severe poisoning, she said, choosing her words carefully. Your father found you unconscious on the kitchen floor and called 911. The paramedics said your vital signs were extremely unstable when they arrived. Poisoning, the word hung in the air between us like a question mark. What kind of poisoning? We're still waiting for some test results. Dr. Patterson said, but based on your symptoms and the preliminary blood work, it appears you ingested a significant amount of pine oil. Specifically, the kind found in household cleaning products. The room seemed to tilt again, just like it had in the kitchen, but this time it was my understanding of reality that was shifting rather than my physical perception. Pine oil, like pine sol. That would be consistent with what we're seeing. Yes, Dr. Patterson's voice was gentle but firm. The good news is that you're going to be okay. We were able to treat you quickly enough to prevent any permanent damage. But Chloe, this wasn't an accidental ingestion. The amount of pine oil in your system was far too concentrated to have been caused by contamination or mixing up containers. Someone had deliberately poisoned me. The thought was so enormous, so impossible to process, that my brain simply rejected it at first. Things like this didn't happen to people like me, in houses like my father's, in families that looked normal from the outside. This was the kind of story you heard on true crime podcasts, not something that happened in your own kitchen while you were getting ready for work. "Where's my dad?" I asked suddenly, desperate to see his familiar face, to have him explain that this was all some terrible mistake. "He's in the waiting room, with your stepmother," Dr. Patterson said. "They've been here since you were admitted. Would you like me to get them?" I nodded, though part of me wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation was about to happen. How do you look at your family after learning that someone tried to poison you? How do you sit in a room with people you trust and wonder which one of them wanted you dead? Dr. Patterson stepped out, and I was left alone with the beeping machines, and the terrible quiet of my own thoughts. Through the small window in my room, I could see it was dark outside, which meant I'd lost an entire day. My co-workers at Grind Coffee House were probably wondering why I hadn't shown up for my shift. My friend Zoe had probably sent several increasingly worried text messages that I hadn't answered. The door opened, and my father rushed in, his face pale and drawn with worry. Gregory had always been a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, but he looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever he'd been through in the hours since finding me unconscious.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His usually neat hair was disheveled, and his shirt was wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in a waiting room chair. "Chloe, sweetheart," he said, taking my hand in both of his. "Thank God you're okay. When I found you on the floor, I thought—" His voice broke, and he squeezed my fingers gently. "I thought I'd lost you." Victoria entered behind him, moving with her characteristic composed efficiency. She'd changed clothes since the morning, trading her business attire for a soft sweater and jeans that made her look more approachable, more like the concerned stepmother she was supposed to be. Her makeup was perfectly applied despite the long day at the hospital, and her blonde hair was still styled in soft waves that framed her face. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, though she remained near the door, rather than approaching the bed. "We've been so worried." Looking at her now, knowing what I knew, I found myself studying her face for signs of guilt or deception. But Victoria had always been hard to read, one of those people who seemed to exist behind a polished veneer that never quite cracked. Even during family dinners or holiday celebrations, she maintained a certain distance, as if she was performing the role of stepmother rather than actually living it. "The doctor says someone put pine sol in my coffee," I said, watching both of their faces carefully. "She says it was too much to be an accident." My father's grip on my hand tightened, and I saw genuine shock and horror in his eyes. "That's impossible," he said immediately. "Who would do something like that? And why?" Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral, concerned but not surprised. "That's just terrible," she said, shaking her head slowly. "Do the doctors have any idea who might have done such a thing? Maybe someone broke into the house while we were sleeping." It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of explanation that would make sense if you didn't know better. But something about the way she said it, the slightly rehearsed quality of her concern, made my stomach clench with a different kind of nausea than the poisoning had caused. Nothing else was missing or disturbed, my father said, running his free hand through his hair. The doors were still locked, the alarm was still set. Whoever did this had access to the house. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Someone with access to the house, someone who knew my routines, someone who had the opportunity to doctor my coffee without being detected. The list of suspects was very, very short. Victoria moved closer to the bed, her expression shifting to something that might have been hurt feelings. "Gregory, you can't seriously think that someone in our family would do something like this. We love Chloe. She's part of our family." "I'm not accusing anyone," Dad said quickly, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the same terrible calculations I was making. "I'm just trying to understand how this could have happened." Dr. Patterson returned, with a clipboard and a serious expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I need to inform you that we're required to report this incident to the police. Deliberate poisoning is a serious crime, and they'll want to investigate." Police. The word made everything feel more real, more official. This wasn't just a family crisis anymore. It was a criminal matter. Someone in my family had tried to kill me, and now the state of Oregon was going to get involved. Of course, my father said, though his voice was strained. Whatever you need to do. Victoria nodded as well, but I noticed she'd moved back toward the door, putting distance between herself and the rest of us. We just want whoever did this to be caught, she said. Chloe deserves justice. The next few hours blurred together in a series of police interviews, medical tests, and increasingly uncomfortable conversations with my family. Detective Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 50s, asked detailed questions about my routine, about who had access to the house, about any conflicts or tensions that might provide a motive for someone to harm me. Had you been having any problems with anyone recently? He asked, pen poised over his notepad. Any arguments, disagreements, relationship issues? I thought about the constant low-level tension with Victoria, the way she seemed to view my presence in the house as a temporary inconvenience that had stretched on too long. But those weren't the kind of dramatic conflicts that led to poisoning. They were more like death by 1,000 paper cuts, small slights, and subtle disapprovals that accumulated over time. Nothing major, I said finally. Normal family stuff, I guess. Detective Morrison made a note, and moved on to questions about household routines, about who made the coffee, about whether I'd noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the incident. I told him about the strange taste, about how Victoria had been the only other person awake when I got sick, about how calm she'd seemed despite the obvious medical emergency. When he interviewed Victoria separately, I could hear her voice through the thin hospital walls, steady and composed as she answered his questions. She expressed shock and concern, offered theories about possible break-ins or random attacks, and positioned herself as another victim of this terrible crime against our family. But something nagged at me, some detail that felt important, but that I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was finally discharged and riding home in the passenger seat of my father's truck, that it hit me. Victoria had known exactly what was wrong with me. When I'd called out for help, when I'd said something was wrong with the coffee, she hadn't seemed surprised or confused. She'd moved with purpose, like someone following a script she'd already rehearsed. And that smell I'd noticed, that sharp, clean scent that reminded me of a doctor's office, that had been the smell of pine oil, the industrial-strength cleaning product she used in her obsessive household management. The house on Maple Avenue looked the same as always when we pulled into the driveway, but everything felt different now. The cheerful yellow paint and neat landscaping seemed like a facade hiding something darker underneath. My father helped me out of the truck, his hand gentle on my elbow, as if he was afraid I might collapse again. Victoria met us at the front door, wearing another of her crisp blouses, and her usual bright smile. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to hug me. "I'm so glad you're feeling better." Her embrace felt different than it had before, her hands lingering on my back in a way that made my skin crawl. When she pulled away, I caught that same sharp, clean smell I'd noticed in the hospital, fainter now but still present, pine oil, the smell of the product that had nearly killed me. That night, lying in my bed in the room Victoria had decorated for me when I'd first moved in, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly what had happened to me, and I was going to make sure it never happened again. Not to me, and not to anyone else who might cross Victoria's path. I just had no idea how deep the rabbit hole was about to go, or how far Victoria had been willing to go to get me out of her perfectly ordered life. But I was about to find out, and when I did, I was going to make sure the whole world knew exactly who Victoria really was behind that polished smile and those concerned expressions. The truth was about to come out, and it was going to be more twisted than anything I could have imagined. The next morning brought a steady drizzle that matched my mood perfectly. I woke up groggy and disoriented, my body still recovering from whatever Victoria had put in my system. The house felt different now, like a place where terrible things could happen behind cheerful yellow walls and carefully arranged throw pillows. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the hallway, seemed threatening in ways they never had before. Dylan was already at the breakfast table when I came downstairs, spooning cereal into his mouth while scrolling through his phone. My half-brother looked up when I entered, his expression a mixture of concern and awkwardness that told me he'd been filled in on the official story, but wasn't quite sure how to act around me now. "Hey," he said, setting down his spoon. "Dad told me what happened. That's really messed up. Someone breaking in and poisoning you like that. Someone breaking in." So that was the narrative they were going with. I glanced toward the kitchen, where I could hear Victoria moving around, preparing breakfast with her usual efficient precision. The sound of her heels clicking against the tile floor sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Yeah," I said, carefully pulling out the chair across from Dylan. Really messed up. Victoria appeared in the doorway, carrying a plate of perfectly arranged fruit and toast cut into precise triangles. She dressed for the day in a soft pink sweater that made her look maternal and caring, though I noticed she wore rubber gloves that she quickly peeled off and disposed of before approaching the table. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, setting the plate in front of me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought you might want something light on your stomach after everything you've been through." The fruit looked beautiful, each piece cut to exactly the same size, and arranged in a pattern that belonged in a magazine spread. But the sight of food that Victoria had prepared made my stomach turn. I pushed the plate away gently, trying to look grateful rather than suspicious. "Thanks, but I'm not really hungry yet," I said. "Maybe I'll grab something at work later." "Work?" Victoria's eyebrows rose in what looked like genuine surprise. "Honey, you just got out of the hospital yesterday. Don't you think you should take some time to recover?" "The doctor cleared me," I said, which wasn't entirely true. Patterson had recommended light activity, but hadn't specifically addressed when I should return to work. I can't afford to miss more shifts. This was true. My job at Grind Coffee House paid barely above minimum wage, and I'd already used up most of my meager savings on student loan payments and helping Dad with household expenses that Victoria deemed necessary. Missing work meant missing rent money for the apartment I was desperately trying to save up for. Victoria's expression shifted to something that might have been disapproval, though she covered it quickly with renewed concern. "Well, if you're sure you're feeling up to it," she said, "just promise me you'll be careful. Whoever did this to you is still out there." The way she said it, with just the right amount of worry in her voice, made my skin crawl. She was good at this, I realized. Really good at playing the concerned stepmother while somehow managing to sound like she was issuing a warning rather than expressing care. My father appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for work in his insurance adjuster uniform. Gregory looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a worried uncertainty that made him seem smaller somehow. "You sure you should be going to work today, kiddo?" he asked, echoing Victoria's concerns but with genuine parental worry in his voice. "I could call in, stay home with you if you want." "I'll be fine, Dad," I said, standing up from the table. "Being around people will probably be good for me." What I didn't say was that being around people who weren't Victoria felt like the safest place I could be right now. The coffee shop was public, well lit, and full of witnesses. If something happened to me there, it couldn't be blamed on mysterious intruders. The bus ride downtown gave me time to think, watching the familiar streets of Portland roll past through rain-streaked windows. Other passengers sat absorbed in their phones or staring out at the gray morning, oblivious to the fact that someone had tried to murder me less than 48 hours earlier. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, like I was watching life happen from behind glass. Grind Coffee House occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, its exposed brick walls and industrial lighting creating the kind of deliberately casual atmosphere that attracted freelancers and college students. The familiar smell of roasted beans and steamed milk hit me as soon as I walked through the door, usually comforting but now tinged with memories of that terrible taste in my kitchen. Zoe was behind the espresso machine, her curly hair pulled back in a colorful bandana, steam wand hissing as she prepared someone's morning latte. My best friend since college looked up when the door chimed, and her face immediately shifted from professional barista smile to genuine relief. "Chloe," she called out, abandoning the espresso machine to rush around the counter. "Where have you been? I've been texting you for 2 days. Marcus said you called in sick, but you never just disappear like that." Marcus, our manager, emerged from the back office at the sound of my name. He was a laid-back guy in his 30s who'd opened Grind after getting burned out in the tech industry, and he ran the place with the kind of relaxed efficiency that made it a pleasant place to work. "Hey, glad you're feeling better," he said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced I should be there. "You look a little pale. You sure you're up for a full shift?" I realized I hadn't thought through how to explain my absence without getting into the whole poisoning story. The last thing I wanted was to deal with a bunch of questions and concerned looks from coworkers who barely knew me outside of our shared shifts. "Food poisoning," I said, which was technically true even if it missed some crucial details. "Pretty bad, but I'm better now." Zoe studied my face with the kind of intense scrutiny that came from years of friendship. "Food poisoning doesn't usually require 2 days off," she said quietly, pulling me aside while Marcus went back to his office. "And you look like you've seen a ghost. What's really going on?" This was the moment I had to decide how much to tell her. Zoe had been my roommate junior year, the person who'd held my hair back during finals week stress vomiting and who'd helped me move out of my terrible apartment when I couldn't afford the rent increase. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was her. But saying it out loud felt dangerous somehow, like naming the thing would make it more real and more likely to happen again. And there was still a small part of me that wondered if I was being paranoid, if there was some innocent explanation for what had happened that I was missing. "Can we talk after work?" I asked finally. "Somewhere private." Zoe nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't diminish. "Of course, but Chloe, if something's wrong, if someone's hurting you." "I'm okay," I said, cutting her off before she could finish the thought. "I promise. Just give me a few hours to get through my shift, and then we'll talk." The morning rush helped distract me from the constant low-level anxiety that had settled in my chest like a weight. Taking orders, making drinks, and chatting with regular customers provided a rhythm that felt normal and safe. These people knew me as the friendly barista who remembered their usual orders and asked about their kids or their jobs. They had no idea that someone had recently tried to kill me, and their oblivious normalcy was oddly comforting. Around 11, when the rush had died down and the coffee shop had settled into its mid-morning quiet, my phone buzzed with a text message. The number wasn't in my contacts, but the area code was local. "This is Detective Morrison. Would you be available to come to the station this afternoon to answer some follow-up questions? We've made some progress on your case." Progress. The word sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I quickly typed back that I could be there after my shift ended at 3, then spent the rest of my workday trying not to think about what kind of progress the police might have made. When Zoe and I finally sat down at our usual corner table after closing, she didn't waste time with small talk. "Okay," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "Tell me what's really going on. And don't say food poisoning again, because I've seen you with food poisoning, and this isn't it." So I told her everything. About waking up in the hospital, about the pine sol in my bloodstream, about Victoria's strange behavior and the way she'd seemed almost prepared for my medical emergency. Zoe listened without interrupting, her expression growing more alarmed with each detail. "Holy shit, Chloe," she said when I finished. "Someone actually tried to poison you. In your own house. The police think it was Victoria," I said quietly, voicing the suspicion I'd been carrying around like a stone in my stomach. "I mean, they haven't said that directly, but she's the only one who had the opportunity." Zoe leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her curls. "But why? I mean, I know she's not your biggest fan, but poisoning someone is a huge leap from just not liking your stepdaughter." That was the question that had been eating at me since I'd woken up in the hospital. Victoria had never been warm or maternal toward me, but she'd never been openly hostile either. Our relationship was more like polite coexistence, the kind of careful distance that many blended families navigate. What could have pushed her from mild irritation to attempted murder? "Maybe it's about the house," I said, thinking out loud. "I've been living there almost a year now, and Victoria's always been weird about space and territory. She's constantly rearranging things and talking about optimizing the household. Optimizing by getting rid of you permanently." Zoe's voice was incredulous. "Chloe, that's insane. Normal people don't commit murder over living arrangements." "Victoria's not normal people," I said, remembering all the small moments that had felt slightly off over the past year. "She's obsessed with control and image. Maybe having me around messes up whatever perfect family picture she's trying to create." My phone buzzed again, reminding me of my appointment with Detective Morrison. I glanced at the time and realized I needed to leave soon if I was going to make it to the police station by 4. "I have to go," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "The detective wants to see me. He says they've made progress." Zoe stood up too, her expression serious. "Chloe, promise me you'll be careful. If Victoria really did try to poison you once, she might try again. Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while." The suggestion made sense, but I couldn't afford a hotel, and I wasn't ready to impose on friends who were barely getting by themselves. Besides, running away felt like admitting defeat, and some stubborn part of me wasn't ready to let Victoria win by driving me out of my father's house. "I'll be careful," I promised, hugging Zoe goodbye. "And I'll call you after I talk to the police." The Portland Police Bureau's central precinct occupied a blocky concrete building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Detective Morrison met me in the lobby, looking even more tired than he had at the hospital, but with an alertness in his eyes that suggested he'd found something important. "Thanks for coming in," he said, leading me through a maze of cubicles to a small interview room. I wanted to update you on what we've found so far. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a police station: fluorescent lighting, gray walls, and a metal table that had seen better days. Detective Morrison gestured for me to sit down, then pulled out a thick folder that he placed on the table between us. "First, the good news," he said, opening the folder to reveal several lab reports. "We've confirmed that the pine sol was definitely in your coffee, not something you ingested elsewhere. The concentration was significant enough to cause serious harm, potentially fatal if you'd consumed the entire cup." The casual way he delivered this information made my stomach clench. I'd come much closer to dying than I'd realized. "We've also processed the mug and found some interesting evidence," Detective Morrison continued, pulling out a series of photographs. "There were 2 sets of fingerprints on the handle, yours, which we'd expect, and another set that we're currently trying to identify." He slid one of the photos across the table. It showed my university mug, the one with the faded logo that Victoria had always criticized, covered in what looked like black powder where the fingerprints had been lifted. "The placement of the unknown prints suggests someone handled the mug after you'd already used it," the detective explained. "They're overlapping your prints in a way that indicates the mug was washed and then handled again." "Victoria always does the dishes," I said, though even as I said it, I realized how weak it sounded as evidence. "She's very particular about keeping the kitchen clean." "That's what we thought initially," Detective Morrison said. "But here's where it gets interesting." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a close-up of the fingerprint. "We ran these through our database and got a hit. The prints belong to someone with a criminal record." My heart started racing. "Victoria has a criminal record." "Not Victoria," the detective said, his expression grim. "The prints belong to a man named Thomas Chen, who served time for assault with a deadly weapon about 8 years ago. He was released from prison 2 years ago, and has been working odd jobs since then, including some cleaning and maintenance work." This wasn't what I'd expected at all, so it wasn't Victoria. "We're not ruling anyone out yet," Detective Morrison said carefully. "Thomas Chen has no known connection to your family, and there's no evidence he was ever in your house. But someone put his fingerprints on that mug, and we need to figure out how and why." I stared at the photograph, trying to make sense of this new information. If Victoria hadn't poisoned me directly, had she hired someone else to do it? That seemed even more premeditated and calculating than doing it herself. "There's something else," the detective said, pulling out yet another document. "We've been looking into your stepmother's background, just as a matter of routine. She's got a clean record, no criminal history, but we found some interesting financial information." He showed me a bank statement with several highlighted transactions. "These are payments from Victoria's personal account to a company called Pacific Coast Services. It's a cleaning and maintenance business that employs several people with criminal records, including Thomas Chen." The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made my blood run cold. Victoria hadn't gotten her hands dirty directly, but she'd found someone else to do it for her. Someone desperate enough for work that they'd be willing to commit a serious crime for the right price. "Do you think she paid him to poison me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's one possibility we're investigating," Detective Morrison said. "But we need more evidence before we can make any arrests. What I need from you is to think about anything unusual that might have happened in the days or weeks before you were poisoned. Any strangers in the house, any changes to routines, anything that might help us build a timeline." I thought back over the previous weeks, trying to remember if there had been any service calls or maintenance visits that might have provided an opportunity for Thomas Chen to access our kitchen. Victoria was always having things cleaned or repaired, or optimized, a constant stream of professionals coming through to maintain her vision of domestic perfection. "She had the carpets cleaned, about 2 weeks ago," I said slowly. "And there was something wrong with the garbage disposal the week before that. She called a repair service." Detective Morrison made notes as I talked, asking for details about times and dates, and whether I'd been home during any of these service calls. Most of the time I'd been at work, leaving Victoria to supervise whatever maintenance was being done. "We'll check into those companies, see if Thomas Chen worked for any of them," the detective said. "In the meantime, I need to ask you something important. Do you feel safe staying in that house?" The question I'd been avoiding all day finally confronted me directly. Did I feel safe living with someone who had potentially hired a criminal to poison me? Someone who was now walking around free, knowing that the police were investigating but not yet able to prove anything. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't really have anywhere else to go." Detective Morrison's expression softened slightly. "We can help you explore some options if you decide you want to leave." There are victim services programs that might be able to assist with temporary housing. The word victim hit me harder than I'd expected. I was a victim now, someone who needed protection and assistance and special services. It wasn't an identity I'd ever imagined for myself, and accepting it felt like admitting a kind of defeat. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course," the detective said, closing the folder. "But Chloe, if Victoria did orchestrate this, she's likely to be very careful now that she knows we're investigating. That might make you safer in the short term, but it also means she's probably thinking about her next move. Don't let your guard down." I left the police station with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that my life had become something I no longer recognized. The bus ride home felt surreal, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary evening routines, while I sat there knowing that someone had paid a stranger to try to kill me. The house on Maple Avenue looked exactly the same as always when I walked up the front steps, but everything had changed. Victoria's car was in the driveway, which meant she was home, probably preparing dinner with her usual meticulous attention to detail. The thought of eating anything she'd prepared made my stomach turn. I found her in the kitchen, standing at the stove stirring something that smelled like tomato sauce and herbs. She'd changed into casual clothes, jeans and a soft sweater that made her look like any other suburban stepmother cooking dinner for her family. But now I saw the performance in it, the way she'd carefully constructed this image of domestic normalcy. "Oh, good, you're home," she said, looking up with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm making your father's favorite pasta. How was work?" "Fine," I said, staying near the doorway rather than entering the kitchen fully. "Where's Dad?" "Still at the office," Victoria said, turning back to the stove. "He had to deal with some complicated claim that came in today. He probably won't be home until after 7. So we were alone in the house, just the two of us and whatever game Victoria was playing. I wondered if she knew about Thomas Chen yet, if the police had contacted her for questioning. Her behavior seemed normal, but then again, someone who could orchestrate a poisoning was probably pretty good at acting normal. "I'm not very hungry," I said. "I think I'll just go upstairs and rest." "You should eat something," Victoria said, her tone carrying just a hint of insistence. "You're still recovering. Your body needs fuel." The word fuel made me think of the pine sol in my coffee, the chemical fuel that had nearly stopped my heart. I shook my head and backed toward the stairs. "Maybe later," I said. In my room, I locked the door and sat on my bed, trying to process everything I'd learned at the police station. Victoria had hired someone to poison me, someone with a criminal record who was desperate enough for work to commit attempted murder. It was so calculated, so cold, that it made my previous suspicions seem almost naive in comparison. But why? What had I done to make her want me dead? I'd been a polite, unobtrusive presence in her house, contributing to expenses and staying out of her way. I wasn't competing with her for my father's attention or challenging her authority in any meaningful way. Unless that was exactly the problem. Maybe my very existence as Gregory's daughter threatened the perfect family narrative Victoria was trying to create. Maybe having me around was a constant reminder that my father had a life before her, connections and loyalties that predated their marriage. My phone rang, startling me out of my dark thoughts. Zoe's name appeared on the screen, and I answered gratefully. "How did it go with the police?" she asked without preamble. I told her about Thomas Chen, about the fingerprints and the cleaning service, and the possibility that Victoria had hired someone to do her dirty work. Zoe listened in increasingly horrified silence. "Chloe, you can't stay there," she said when I finished. "This isn't just about someone losing their temper or making a mistake. This is premeditated attempted murder. She planned this." "I know," I said quietly, "but I still don't have anywhere else to go." "You can stay with me," Zoe said immediately. "My couch isn't much, but it's safe, and it's only temporary, until you figure out something more permanent." The offer was tempting, incredibly tempting. Zoe's tiny studio apartment was cramped and expensive, but it was also filled with friendship and honesty and all the things that were missing from the house on Maple Avenue. "I can't impose like that," I said, though part of me was already mentally packing my few belongings. "You're not imposing," Zoe said firmly. "You're accepting help from someone who cares about you, which is what normal people do when psychopaths try to murder them." Before I could respond, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate. Victoria's voice drifted through the door, calling my name with saccharine sweetness. "Chloe, honey, dinner's ready. Your father just got home." I looked at the locked door, knowing that Victoria was standing on the other side, probably wondering why I'd suddenly started barricading myself in my room. How long before she figured out that I knew about Thomas Chen? How long before she decided that hiring someone else hadn't worked and it was time to try a more direct approach? I have to go, I whispered to Zoe. But you're right, I can't stay here much longer. Promise me you won't eat anything she gives you, Zoe said urgently. Promise me you'll be careful until you can get out of there. I promised, hung up the phone and stared at the door that was the only thing standing between me and someone who wanted me dead. Tomorrow I decided I would start making plans to leave. Tonight I just had to survive. Outside my room, Victoria called my name again, her voice still sweet but with an edge of impatience that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and prepared to face whatever performance she had planned for family dinner. The game was far from over, and I was only beginning to understand how dangerous Victoria really was. Dinner that night felt like a theatrical performance where everyone knew their lines except me. Victoria had set the table with her good china, the cream-colored plates with gold trim that she usually reserved for holidays or when her book club friends came over. Candles flickered in crystal holders, casting warm shadows across the dining room walls lined with family photos that suddenly seemed more sinister than sentimental. My father sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up after his long day investigating insurance claims. Gregory looked older in the candlelight, the stress of the past few days etched in new lines around his eyes. He'd always been a simple man who took people at face value, and the idea that someone in his own home might be dangerous seemed to age him in real time. "This looks wonderful, honey," he said to Victoria, who was serving portions of pasta with practiced efficiency. "You've outdone yourself." Victoria beamed at the compliment, playing the devoted wife role with expert precision. She'd changed into a dress for dinner, something flowing and feminine that made her look soft and nurturing. But I found myself watching her hands as she served the food, remembering what Detective Morrison had told me about premeditation and criminal conspiracies. "I thought we could use a nice family dinner after everything that's happened," she said, settling into her chair across from me. "It's important to come together during difficult times." Dylan appeared from upstairs, his hair still damp from a shatter and his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. My half-brother had been quieter than usual since the poisoning, shooting me uncertain glances when he thought I wasn't looking. At 16, he was old enough to understand that something serious had happened but young enough to be confused by the adult complexities surrounding it. "Smells good, Mom," he said, sliding into his chair and immediately reaching for the garlic bread. Victoria wasn't his biological mother, but he'd started calling her Mom when she married our father 3 years ago. The easy acceptance had always made me feel like an outsider in my own family. "How was school today?" Victoria asked, cutting her pasta into precise identical pieces. Everything she did had this quality of careful control, as if spontaneity might somehow upset the delicate balance of her world. Dylan launched into a story about some drama in his chemistry class, while I pushed food around my plate, hyper-aware of every bite that went into my mouth. The pasta sauce was rich and flavorful, exactly the kind of thing my father loved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that every meal Victoria prepared might be my last. "You're not eating much, sweetheart," Victoria observed, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal concern. "Are you still feeling unwell?" 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and I realized I was being studied. My father's expression was worried, Dylan looked curious, and Victoria's face showed nothing but appropriate stepmother worry. But there was something else there, something calculating behind her concerned smile. "Just tired," I said, forcing myself to take another bite. "It's been a long day." "Of course it has," Victoria said soothingly. "Going back to work so soon after being in the hospital. I still think you should have taken more time to recover." She was good at this, I realized. Really good at sounding caring while somehow making it clear that my choices were questionable. It was the same tone she'd used for months whenever I did something that didn't align with her vision of how I should behave. "The doctor said light activity would be fine," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "And I can't afford to miss more work." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, if money is an issue, I'm sure your father and I could help you out. Family takes care of family, after all." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but I caught the implication underneath. Accept financial help from Victoria, become more dependent on her goodwill, give her more control over my life and decisions. It was the kind of trap that closed slowly, so gradually that you didn't realize you were caught until it was too late. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I prefer to be independent." "Independence is admirable." Victoria said, cutting another precise piece of pasta. But sometimes it's just pride in disguise. There's nothing wrong with accepting help when you need it. My father nodded along with this wisdom, completely missing the undercurrent of tension flowing between Victoria and me. Gregory had always been better with concrete problems like insurance claims and car repairs than with the subtle dynamics of human relationships. The conversation moved on to safer topics. Dylan talked about an upcoming basketball game. My father mentioned a particularly complex claim he was working on, and Victoria discussed her plans for redecorating the guest bathroom. Normal family dinner conversation that would have been comforting if I didn't know that one of the people at the table had recently tried to have me killed. After dinner, I helped clear the table despite Victoria's protests that I should rest. I wanted to stay close, to observe her behavior and look for any signs that she knew the police were closing in. But she seemed perfectly calm, washing dishes with her usual methodical precision while humming softly to herself. "Chloe, could you grab that serving bowl from the dining room?" she asked, her hands busy with soapy water. The blue one on the sideboard. I went to retrieve the bowl, noting how Victoria had positioned herself so she could watch me through the kitchen doorway. When I returned, she was standing at the sink with her back to me, her shoulders tense in a way that contradicted her casual humming. "Just set it on the counter," she said without turning around. "I'll get to it in a minute." As I placed the bowl down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on the counter next to the sink was a small bottle of concentrated pine cleaner, the industrial-strength kind that Victoria used for her deep cleaning projects. The cap was slightly loose, as if it had been recently opened and hastily closed again. The sight of it so close to where our dishes were being washed sent a jolt of panic through my system. Was she planning to contaminate something else? Or was this just Victoria's normal cleaning routine, and I was seeing threats where none existed? "Everything okay back there?" my father called from the living room, where he'd settled in with his newspaper and the evening news. "Just finishing up," Victoria replied, her voice cheerful and normal. But when she finally turned around, I caught something in her expression that disappeared too quickly to identify. Satisfaction, maybe, or anticipation. "I think I'll head upstairs," I said, backing toward the kitchen doorway. "Read a little before bed." "Sweet dreams, honey," Victoria said, already turning back to her dishes. "Sleep well," the words sounded like a threat. In my room, I sat on my bed with my laptop open, staring at the screen without really seeing it. The weight of what I'd learned at the police station pressed down on me like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. Victoria hadn't just snapped in a moment of anger or frustration. She'd planned this, researched it, found someone willing to commit attempted murder for money. I pulled up a search engine and typed in Thomas Chen criminal record Portland. The results were sparse, just a few mentions in court records and news articles from 8 years ago. According to a brief report in the Oregonian, Thomas had been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon after attacking a co-worker with a wrench during an argument at a construction site. He'd served 4 years in prison and been released on parole. The photos accompanying the articles showed a thin man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair, and the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd lived a hard life. He didn't look like a killer, more like someone who'd made a series of bad choices and ended up in a place he'd never intended to be. But that was probably exactly what made him perfect for Victoria's purposes. Someone desperate enough for work that he'd be willing to take on jobs that more established criminals might avoid. Someone with enough of a record that if he got caught, his word wouldn't carry much weight against that of a respectable suburban stepmother. I searched for Pacific Coast Services next, the cleaning company that employed Thomas Chen. Their website was basic but professional, featuring photos of uniformed workers cleaning office buildings and residential homes. They specialize in deep cleaning and maintenance services, and proudly advertised that they gave second chances to people with criminal backgrounds who were trying to rebuild their lives. It was actually admirable, in a way. A company committed to helping ex-convicts reintegrate into society by providing honest work and job training. Victoria had perverted that mission, turning their rehabilitation program into her personal assassination service. The more I learned, the more calculated and cold-blooded the whole thing seemed. Victoria hadn't acted in passion or desperation. She'd methodically researched her options, found the perfect patsy, and set up a plan that would have looked like an accident or random crime if it had succeeded. My phone buzzed with a text message, startling me out of my dark research. Zoe's name appeared on the screen. "Just checking in. How was dinner with the family from hell?" I typed back quickly. "Survived, Victoria seems normal, but I found pine cleaner on the kitchen counter. The response came back almost immediately. Get out of there, now, come to my place. Can't just disappear. Dad would freak out and Victoria would know something's up. Then what's your plan? Wait for her to try again. That was exactly what I was afraid of. Victoria had to know that the police investigation was ongoing, that they'd be looking closely at everyone who had access to the house. She'd be more careful now, more subtle, but she'd also be more desperate if she thought I was getting close to exposing her. Another text from Zoe appeared. I'm serious, Chloe. Pack a bag and come over. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. She was right, of course. Staying in a house with someone who'd tried to kill me was beyond stupid. But leaving felt like running away, like letting Victoria win. And there was still the matter of evidence. If I was going to make sure she faced consequences for what she'd done, I needed proof that would hold up in court. I thought about Detective Morrison's words about building a timeline and looking for unusual incidents in the weeks before the poisoning. What if there were other attempts that I'd missed? Other times when Victoria had tried to hurt me but I'd attributed it to accident or coincidence. I opened a new document on my laptop and started typing, creating a chronological list of everything I could remember from the past few months. The time I'd gotten violently sick after eating leftovers that only I had access to. The accidental gas leak in the basement that had given me a headache for days. The suspicious number of times the smoke alarm in my room had malfunctioned, going off in the middle of the night and filling my lungs with acrid smoke before I could turn it off. At the time, each incident had seemed isolated, the kind of random mishaps that happen in any household. But seeing them listed together, I recognized a pattern. Someone had been trying to harm me for months, escalating from minor inconveniences to more serious threats, until finally resorting to outright poisoning. The realization made me feel physically sick. While I'd been going about my daily life, worrying about student loans and work schedules and normal young adult problems, Victoria had been systematically trying to kill me. The sheer coldness of it was breathtaking. I saved the document and emailed it to myself, creating a backup in case something happened to my laptop. Then I started searching for information about documenting evidence and building criminal cases. If the police needed more proof to arrest Victoria, I was going to help them find it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made me slam the laptop shut and scramble into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. A soft knock came at my door, followed by Victoria's voice. Chloe, are you still awake, sweetheart? I lay perfectly still, breathing slowly and evenly, pretending to be asleep. The doorknob turned quietly, and I heard the soft squeak of hinges as the door opened a few inches. Sweet dreams, Victoria whispered into the darkness. After what felt like hours, I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally again, my heart hammering against my ribs. She'd been checking on me, making sure I was where I was supposed to be. The thought of her standing in my doorway, watching me sleep, made my skin crawl. I waited another hour before getting up and quietly pushing my dresser in front of the door. It wouldn't stop someone who was really determined to get in, but it would at least give me warning if anyone tried. Then I retrieved my laptop and continued my research, this time focusing on how to gather evidence without alerting the subject. According to several legal websites, the key was documentation. Photos, videos, audio recordings, anything that could establish a pattern of behavior or capture incriminating statements. Most importantly, any evidence had to be gathered legally to be admissible in court. I thought about the security system my father had installed the previous year, after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. Victoria had insisted on cameras covering all the exterior doors and windows, plus motion sensors throughout the house. But I didn't think there were any cameras inside, which meant the kitchen where I'd been poisoned wasn't being recorded. Unless I set up my own surveillance. The idea was risky, but it might be the only way to catch Victoria in the act if she tried something again. I could use my phone to record video, or maybe set up my old webcam somewhere inconspicuous. The trick would be positioning it where it could capture the kitchen without being noticed. I spent the rest of the night researching hidden camera apps and reading articles about gathering evidence in domestic crimes. The more I learned, the more determined I became to see this through. Victoria thought she'd found the perfect victim in me, someone isolated and dependent who could be eliminated without anyone asking too many questions. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning brought gray skies, and the kind of persistent drizzle that made Portland winters feel endless. I came downstairs to find Victoria already at the breakfast table, dressed for what looked like a day of errands in perfectly coordinated casual wear. She looked up from her tablet with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart. How did you sleep?" "Fine," I lied, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd already made. I studied the liquid carefully before taking a cautious sip, tasting nothing but the slightly bitter brew Victoria preferred. "I'm glad to hear it," she said, returning her attention to the tablet screen. "I was worried about you last night. You seemed tense at dinner." "Just tired," I repeated, settling into a chair across from her. "Still recovering, I guess." Victoria nodded sympathetically, but I noticed she was watching me over the top of her tablet, studying my face with the intensity of someone looking for cracks in a facade. It occurred to me that we were both performing now, both pretending to be something we weren't while trying to read the other's true intentions. "I have some errands to run today," she said, after a moment. "Grocery shopping, dry cleaner, that sort of thing. Would you like to come along? It might be good for you to get out of the house." The invitation sounded innocent enough, but I remembered what Detective Morrison had said about Victoria being careful now that she knew the police were investigating. Taking me out of the house, away from witnesses and security cameras, could provide the perfect opportunity for another attempt. "Thanks, but I'm working a double shift today," I said. Marcus asked me to cover for someone who called in sick. This was true, though I'd volunteered for the extra hours specifically, to avoid spending the day alone with Victoria. The coffee shop felt like the safest place I could be, surrounded by customers and co-workers who would notice if anything happened to me. "That's too bad," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly disappointed. "Well, try not to overdo it. You're still recovering from a very serious incident." She emphasized the word incident in a way that made it sound like she was reminding me of something, issuing a subtle warning about what could happen if I wasn't careful. I finished my coffee quickly and headed upstairs to get ready for work, eager to put distance between myself and Victoria's calculating presence. In my room, I packed my laptop and the notebook where I'd been documenting suspicious incidents. If I was going to build a case against Victoria, I needed to be systematic about it, and the quiet periods between customers at the coffee shop would give me time to organize my thoughts and research. I also grabbed my old webcam from the box of college electronics I'd never unpacked. If I could set up some kind of surveillance in the kitchen, I might be able to catch Victoria in the act of tampering with food or drinks. The camera was small enough to hide, and I could position it to record automatically whenever motion was detected. The trick would be finding a way to install it without Victoria noticing. She cleaned obsessively and knew the position of every object in the house. Anything new or out of place would be spotted immediately. But I was beginning to understand. Victoria's perfectionism might also be her weakness. She was so focused on controlling every detail of her environment that she might miss threats that came from directions she wasn't watching. At work, I found a corner table where I could spread out my notes without drawing attention from curious coworkers. Zoe was working the afternoon shift, which meant I'd have someone to bounce ideas off of when the morning rush died down. "You look terrible," she said bluntly when she arrived, tying her apron with the efficiency of someone who'd been making coffee for years. "Did you sleep at all last night?" "Not much," I admitted. "I've been thinking about evidence and how to catch Victoria if she tries something else." Zoe's expression darkened. "Chloe, you're not a cop. Leave the evidence gathering to professionals and get yourself somewhere safe." "The professionals need more evidence before they can make an arrest," I said, showing her the timeline I'd created. "Look at this pattern. She's been trying to hurt me for months, but none of it looks deliberate when you consider each incident separately." Zoe read through my notes, her frown deepening with each entry. "This is terrifying," she said when she finished. "She's been escalating this whole time, testing different methods until she found one that almost worked. And now that the poisoning didn't succeed, she's probably planning something else. If I can document it happening, the police will have enough evidence to arrest her. Or she'll succeed in killing you and the documentation won't matter because you'll be dead," Zoe pointed out. "This isn't a game, Chloe. This woman is dangerous." I knew she was right, but I also knew that running away wouldn't solve the problem. Victoria would still be free to try again, maybe with Dylan next if she decided he was inconvenient to her plans. Or she might target someone else entirely, some future victim who wouldn't see the warning signs until it was too late. "I can't just let her get away with this," I said. "She tried to murder me, Zoe. If I don't stop her, she'll do it again." Zoe was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to read my mind. Finally, she sighed and sat down across from me. "Okay," she said, "if you're determined to do this stupid, dangerous thing, then at least let me help. You shouldn't be trying to catch a killer by yourself. The relief I felt at hearing those words was overwhelming. I'd been carrying this burden alone for days, feeling isolated and paranoid and uncertain about my own perceptions. Having someone believe me, someone willing to help, felt like being handed a lifeline when I was drowning. What did you have in mind? I asked. Well, for starters, you're not staying in that house alone with her anymore, Zoe said firmly. If you won't leave permanently, then at least come to my place at night. We'll tell your dad you're staying with me to help process the trauma or something. It was a reasonable compromise, one that would keep me safe during the vulnerable overnight hours while still allowing me to maintain my normal routine during the day. I could continue my surveillance efforts when Victoria thought I wasn't around, setting up cameras or looking for evidence when she was out running errands. That could work, I said slowly. But what about documenting evidence? I can't catch her doing anything if I'm not there. Remote cameras, Zoe said immediately. You can get tiny wireless ones that stream to your phone. Set them up when she's out, monitor the feed from my apartment. If she tries to tamper with food or drinks, you'll have video proof. The plan was risky but doable. It would require careful timing and some technical setup, but it offered a way to gather evidence while minimizing my exposure to danger. Most importantly, it gave me a sense of agency in a situation where I'd felt powerless and reactive. We spent the rest of my shift researching hidden camera options and planning logistics. By the time I was ready to leave work, we'd identified several small wireless cameras that could be concealed in kitchen appliances or decorative objects. They weren't cheap, but Zoe offered to help with the cost, treating it as an investment in keeping me alive. I'll order them tonight and have them delivered to my place, she said as we locked up the coffee shop. That way Victoria won't see any suspicious packages arriving at your house. I hugged her tightly, grateful beyond words for her friendship and support. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, I felt like I had a real plan for taking control of the situation. Victoria's car was in the driveway when I got home, which meant she'd returned from her errands. I found her in the kitchen, putting away groceries with her usual methodical precision. She looked up when I entered, her face lighting up with what looked like genuine pleasure. Perfect timing, she said, pulling a bag of my favorite pasta from one of the grocery bags. I picked up ingredients for that dish you like, the one with the mushrooms and garlic. I thought we could have a nice family dinner tonight. The offer should have been touching, a stepmother making an effort to cook something special for her stepdaughter. Instead, it made my skin crawl. Victoria had never shown interest in my food preferences before, and the timing felt ominous given everything I'd learned about her escalating attempts to harm me. That's thoughtful, I managed to say, but I'm actually staying at Zoe's tonight. We're working on a project together. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. A project? What kind of project? Just some writing stuff, I said vaguely. We're collaborating on something for her blog. It was a weak lie, but Victoria didn't press for details. Instead, she returned to putting away groceries, her movements slightly more sharp and controlled than they'd been moments before. Well, that's too bad, she said, not looking at me. I was looking forward to a nice family evening. We haven't had many of those lately. The passive-aggressive disappointment in her voice was familiar, the same tone she used whenever my choices didn't align with her plans. But now I heard the threat underneath it, the suggestion that my absence was somehow selfish or problematic. Maybe tomorrow night, I said, backing toward the kitchen doorway. I should go pack some things. Of course, Victoria said, finally looking up with that bright artificial smile. Have fun with your project. In my room, I threw clothes and toiletries into an overnight bag, my hands shaking slightly as I thought about how close I'd come to eating dinner prepared by someone who'd already tried to poison me once. The pattern was clear now, Victoria offering special meals, showing unusual interest in my food preferences, creating opportunities to tamper with what I consumed. I was beginning to understand that every meal, every drink, every seemingly innocent gesture of care was potentially a weapon in Victoria's hands. The realization made me feel paranoid and exhausted, but it also sharpened my resolve to see this through to the end. Victoria thought she was dealing with a naive victim who would never suspect her stepmother of attempted murder. She was about to discover that her intended victim had become her worst nightmare, someone who knew exactly what she was capable of and was determined to gather the evidence needed to stop her. The game had changed, and Victoria didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out. Zoe's studio apartment felt like a sanctuary after the oppressive atmosphere of my father's house. The space was cluttered with art supplies and coffee shop merchandise, books stacked in precarious towers, and fairy lights strung along the windows that cast everything in a warm, welcoming glow. Most importantly, it felt honest in a way that my father's house never had. Every object placed there because Zoe actually wanted it rather than because it fit some carefully curated image. The cameras should arrive tomorrow, Zoe said, curled up on her couch with her laptop balanced on her knees. I paid extra for overnight delivery because honestly, I don't want you going back there without some kind of backup plan. I sat cross-legged on her floor, surrounded by printouts and notebook pages covered in my increasingly frantic handwriting. Over the past few hours, I'd expanded my timeline to include every suspicious incident I could remember, going back to when I'd first moved in with Dad and Victoria. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. Look at this, I said, holding up a sheet of paper covered in dates and brief descriptions. The first incident was just 2 weeks after I moved in. I got food poisoning from leftovers that had been in the refrigerator for less than a day. At the time I figured maybe the power had gone out or something, but now you realize she was testing the waters, Zoe finished grimly. Seeing if she could make you sick without anyone suspecting anything. And when that didn't work, she moved on to other things. The gas leak that gave me headaches for a week. The smoke detector in my room that kept malfunctioning and filling my lungs with toxic fumes. Each incident was worse than the last. Zoe set down her laptop and moved to sit beside me on the floor, studying my timeline with the same intensity she brought to creating foam art in coffee cups. This is methodical, she said finally. She wasn't acting in anger or desperation. This was a long-term campaign. The word campaign sent a chill through me because it was exactly right. Victoria had been waging war against me for almost a year, using tactics so subtle that I'd never recognized them as attacks. She'd played the role of concerned stepmother while systematically trying to eliminate me from the family equation. What I don't understand is why, I said, voicing the question that had been haunting me since this all began. I mean, I know she's never been warm to me, but I've tried to stay out of her way. I contribute to household expenses. I don't interfere with her relationship with Dad. What did I do to make her want me dead? Zoe was quiet for a long moment, her finger tracing patterns on the hardwood floor. Maybe it's not about what you did, she said finally. Maybe it's about who you are. What do you mean? Think about it, Zoe said, warming to her theory. Victoria married your dad 3 years ago, and suddenly she had this instant family. Dylan was just a kid, easy to mold and influence. But you were already an adult with your own personality and opinions. You're evidence of your dad's life before her. The insight hit me like a physical blow, because it made perfect sense. Victoria's obsession with control extended to every aspect of her environment, from the way she organized the kitchen cabinets, to the carefully curated social media posts that painted her life as picture perfect. My very existence disrupted that narrative. She wants to erase me, I said slowly, the words feeling strange and terrible in my mouth. Literally erase me from the family. And when you moved back home after college, you became an obstacle she couldn't ignore, Zoe added. You were supposed to launch into your own life and disappear, but instead you stayed. You kept being evidence that her perfect nuclear family was actually a blended one. It was a chilling thought, that someone could decide another person's life was inconvenient enough to end. But it explained the escalation, the careful planning, the methodical approach to murder that Victoria had employed. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Where are you? Victoria made that pasta dinner and you missed it. She's upset. The message made my stomach turn. Victoria was upset that her latest attempt to poison me had been thwarted by my absence. I showed the text to Zoe, who shook her head in disgust. She's not even trying to hide it anymore. Zoe said, that's either really stupid or really arrogant. Probably both, I replied, typing back to my father that I was safe at Zoe's and would be staying the night. His response came quickly. Okay, just wanted to make sure you were all right. Love you. At least Dad still seemed to care about my well-being, even if he was completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was trying to kill his daughter. I wondered how he'd react when the truth came out, whether he'd be able to accept that the woman he loved was capable of such calculated violence. The next morning brought clear skies, and the kind of crisp autumn air that made Portland feel like the best place in the world. Zoe had already left for her opening shift at the coffee shop, leaving me alone with my research and a growing sense of urgency about gathering evidence before Victoria tried again. The package with the hidden cameras arrived just after 10, delivered to Zoe's door by a cheerful courier who had no idea he was delivering surveillance equipment for a potential murder investigation. Inside the unmarked box were 3 tiny wireless cameras, each no bigger than a button, along with instructions for connecting them to a smartphone app. I spent an hour practicing with the setup, learning how to position the cameras for optimal viewing angles and how to access the live feed from my phone. The technology was remarkably sophisticated, offering high-definition video with audio and motion-activated recording that could run for days on a single battery charge. The real challenge would be installing them in my father's house without Victoria noticing. She was obsessively observant about her environment, the kind of person who would notice if a picture frame was moved half an inch, or if someone had been in her spice cabinet. Any surveillance equipment would have to be perfectly camouflaged. I called in sick to work, claiming a recurrence of symptoms from the poisoning, which gave me the entire day to plan my installation strategy. Victoria typically spent Tuesday afternoons at her book club, a gathering of suburban wives who discussed bestsellers and gossiped about neighborhood drama. The meetings usually ran for at least 2 hours, which should give me enough time to get in and out without being detected. My father would be at work, and Dylan would be at school, which meant the house would be empty except for whatever security system Victoria had installed. But I still had my key and knew the alarm code, so getting inside wouldn't be a problem. The bigger challenge was predicting where Victoria might make her next attempt. The kitchen was the obvious choice, given her history with the coffee poisoning, but she might try something different now that she knew I was suspicious. My bedroom was another possibility, or maybe the bathroom where she could tamper with toiletries or medications. I decided to place one camera in the kitchen, hidden inside a decorative ceramic container that held cooking utensils. The second would go in my bedroom, concealed in the fake plant Victoria had insisted on placing on my dresser. The third I would keep mobile, moving it to different locations based on Victoria's behavior patterns. At 1 o'clock, I caught the bus back to Hillsdale, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror. This was either going to provide the evidence I needed to put Victoria behind bars, or it was going to get me killed. There didn't seem to be much middle ground. The house on Maple Avenue looked exactly the same as always, its cheerful yellow paint and neat landscaping giving no hint of the dark drama playing out inside. Victoria's car was gone from the driveway, confirming that she'd left for book club as expected. I used my key to enter through the front door, disarming the security system with fingers that shook only slightly. The house felt different when I was alone in it, less oppressive but somehow more threatening. Every creak of the floorboards made me freeze, listening for sounds that might indicate Victoria had returned early. But the house remained silent except for the familiar hum of appliances and the tick of the grandfather clock in the living room. I started in the kitchen, carefully removing utensils from the ceramic container, and positioning the tiny camera so it would have a clear view of the coffee maker, sink and food preparation areas. The lens was so small that it was virtually invisible once I'd nestled it among the wooden spoons and silicone spatulas. Testing the feed on my phone confirmed that the camera was working perfectly, providing a crisp view of Victoria's domain. If she tried to tamper with food or drinks, I'd have video evidence of her in the act. The bedroom camera was trickier to position because Victoria cleaned and reorganized constantly. I finally settled on tucking it into the base of the fake plant, angled so it could see both my bed and the small table where I kept water and any medications. If Victoria tried to poison my pills or contaminate something in my room, the camera would catch her. I was just finishing the installation when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Panic shot through me as I realized Victoria had returned much earlier than expected. I quickly gathered my things and crept to the front window, peering through the curtains to see Victoria's BMW parked behind my father's truck. My father was home early too, which complicated everything. I couldn't just walk out the front door without explaining why I was there when I was supposed to be staying at Zoe's. And if Victoria saw me leaving, she'd know I'd been in the house alone, which might make her suspicious about surveillance. Voices drifted in from the front porch as Victoria and my father approached the door, their conversation too muffled for me to make out individual words, but cheerful enough to suggest this was a normal homecoming rather than Victoria discovering evidence of my presence. I quickly climbed the stairs to my room and positioned myself at my desk as if I'd been there working on something. By the time the front door opened, I was hunched over my laptop with papers spread around me, the picture of a studious daughter who'd come home to work in quiet. "Chloe?" Victoria's voice called from downstairs, surprised but not alarmed. "I thought you were staying." I needed some of my textbooks, I called back, which was a plausible lie since I did keep some college materials in my room. I'm working on that project with her and realized I left important stuff here. Footsteps on the stairs, quick and light. Victoria appeared in my doorway, wearing the kind of outfit that screamed successful book club members' designer jeans, cashmere sweater, and jewelry that managed to look casual and expensive at the same time. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked, though her eyes were scanning my room with the intensity of someone conducting an inspection. "You look a bit flushed." I did feel flushed, but that was from the adrenaline rush of nearly being caught installing surveillance equipment rather than any lingering effects from the poisoning. "Just tired," I said. "I haven't been sleeping well." Victoria stepped into the room, her gaze moving systematically from my desk, to my dresser, to the fake plant that now contained a hidden camera. She paused for just a moment when she reached the plant, her head tilting slightly as if something had caught her attention. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited to see if she'd noticed the tiny lens tucked among the plastic leaves. But after a moment, she moved on, apparently satisfied that everything was as it should be. "Well, don't overdo it with this project," she said, moving to adjust my window blinds with the automatic precision she brought to everything. "You're still recovering from a very serious incident. Your body needs rest to heal properly." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just trying to stay caught up with things." Victoria nodded, but I caught something calculating in her expression, as if she was processing this new information and adjusting her plans accordingly. The fact that I was unpredictable, that I might show up at the house when she wasn't expecting me, clearly complicated whatever she had in mind. "Your father picked up Chinese food for dinner," she said, changing the subject with her usual smooth efficiency. "Kung Pao chicken from that place you like. You're welcome to join us if you want to take a break from your work." The invitation sounded innocent enough, but I remembered the timeline I'd created, and all the suspicious food-related incidents that had preceded the coffee poisoning. Accepting Victoria's offer felt like walking voluntarily into a trap. "That's really sweet," I said, "but I promised Zoe I'd be back by dinner time. We're meeting with someone about the project tonight." Another lie, but Victoria accepted it with a gracious smile that didn't quite hide her disappointment. She lingered in the doorway for another moment, her gaze making one more sweep of the room, as if she was memorizing every detail. "Drive safely," she said, finally. "The roads can be tricky this time of evening." After she left, I waited 15 minutes before quietly packing my things and slipping out of the house. The warning about tricky roads felt like another veiled threat, Victoria's way of reminding me that accidents could happen to people who weren't careful. But now I had eyes inside the house, digital witnesses that would record whatever Victoria did when she thought no one was watching. As I walked to the bus stop, I pulled up the camera feeds on my phone, confirming that both devices were working perfectly, and streaming clear video to my device. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some measure of control over the situation. Victoria thought she was dealing with a naive victim who would never suspect her of attempted murder. She had no idea that her every move was now being recorded, that the evidence of her crimes was accumulating with each passing hour. Back at Zoe's apartment, I showed her the camera feeds, both of us watching the empty kitchen and bedroom, with the fascination of people observing a crime scene in real time. "This is surreal," Zoe said, staring at the live video on my phone screen. "We're literally conducting surveillance on a potential murderer." "A definite murderer," I corrected. "She already tried to kill me once. Now we're just waiting for her to try again, so we can catch her in the act." The thought should have been terrifying, and part of it was. But mostly I felt a grim satisfaction at finally having a plan that put me on the offensive rather than just reacting to Victoria's attacks. She'd had the advantage of surprise and preparation for months. Now it was my turn. We ordered pizza and settled in for what might be a long night of observation. The cameras had motion-activated recording, but we wanted to monitor the live feeds in case something happened that required immediate action, like calling the police or alerting my father. Around 9 o'clock, Victoria appeared in the kitchen feed, moving with her usual purposeful efficiency. She was wearing a different outfit than she'd had on earlier, something more casual but still perfectly coordinated. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she'd traded her jewelry for what looked like rubber gloves. "She's doing something," I said, leaning closer to the phone screen. "Look at how she's dressed. That's not her normal evening routine." Victoria opened several cabinets, removing cleaning supplies and what appeared to be a small bottle of clear liquid. She placed everything on the counter with the methodical precision of someone following a recipe, then began mixing ingredients in a measuring cup. "What the hell is she making?" Zoe whispered, as if Victoria might somehow hear us through the camera feed. Whatever it was, Victoria was being extremely careful about the proportions, using what looked like a medical syringe to measure exact amounts of different liquids. The mixture in the cup remained clear, but seemed to have a slightly viscous quality that caught the kitchen light differently than plain water would. When she finished mixing, Victoria capped the syringe and stored the remaining chemicals back in their original locations. She rinsed the measuring cup thoroughly, dried it with a paper towel, and put it back in the cabinet. Then she took the cup of clear liquid and opened the refrigerator. "She's contaminating something in the fridge," I said, my voice tight with tension. "But I can't see what from this angle." Victoria spent several minutes at the open refrigerator, her body blocking the camera's view of whatever she was doing inside. When she finally closed the door and turned around, the cup was empty, and she was disposing of it in the garbage disposal, running water to wash away any residue. The whole process had taken less than 20 minutes, conducted with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Victoria cleaned up meticulously, leaving no trace of her activity except for the rubber gloves, which she peeled off and threw in the trash. "We got it," I said, my hands shaking with adrenaline. "We actually got video of her preparing poison. But we don't know what she contaminated," Zoe pointed out. "Could be anything in that refrigerator. Your dad or Dylan might eat it before you do." The thought sent a spike of panic through me. I'd been so focused on catching Victoria in the act that I hadn't considered the possibility that innocent family members might become collateral damage in her war against me. I grabbed my phone and called my father, hoping it wasn't too late to prevent anyone from consuming whatever Victoria had just prepared. "Hey kiddo," Dad answered on the second ring. "Everything okay? You sound upset." "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted to check on you guys. How was dinner?" "Good, we saved you some kung pao chicken in case you changed your mind. Victoria just put it in the fridge for you." My blood went cold. Victoria hadn't been contaminating something that was already in the refrigerator. She'd been preparing the leftovers she knew I'd been offered, the food that was specifically intended for me. The chicken that my father had bought from that place I liked wasn't a gesture of family consideration. It was bait in a trap that Victoria had been setting all along. "Dad, don't let anyone eat those leftovers," I said urgently. "I think they might be spoiled or something. I got really sick from takeout earlier this week." "Oh," Dad said, sounding confused but willing to go along with my request. "Sure, I'll let Victoria know. We'll just throw it out." "No, don't throw it out," I said quickly, realizing that the contaminated food was now evidence in a criminal case. "Just leave it in the fridge for now. I'll explain when I see you tomorrow." After I hung up, Zoe and I sat in stunned silence, processing what we'd just witnessed and recorded. Victoria had spent weeks if not months planning this latest attempt, orchestrating a scenario where I'd be offered food that seemed safe and appealing, but was actually designed to finish the job that the coffee poisoning had failed to complete. "We need to call Detective Morrison," Zoe said finally. "This video is exactly what he needs to arrest her." I nodded, but part of me hesitated. Once I made that call, there would be no going back. Victoria would be arrested, my father's world would be shattered, and Dylan would lose the only mother figure he'd known for years. Our family, such as it was, would be destroyed. But the alternative was letting Victoria continue to try to kill me until she eventually succeeded. And now I had proof that she was willing to put other family members at risk as collateral damage in her campaign to eliminate me. I dialed Detective Morrison's number, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to set in motion. When he answered, I could hear the wariness in his voice that came from getting late-night calls in his line of work. "Detective Morrison, it's Chloe. I have video evidence of Victoria preparing poison. She's planning to try again, and this time she's using food that other people in my family might accidentally consume." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Detective Morrison's voice came back, sharp and alert. "Where are you now?" he asked. "At my friend's apartment. Safe, but the contaminated food is still in my father's refrigerator, and I don't think Victoria knows that I recorded her preparing it." "Don't go back to that house," Detective Morrison said firmly. "And don't let your family consume anything Victoria has prepared. I'm going to need that video as evidence, and we'll need to secure the contaminated food for analysis." "What happens next?" I asked. "Next we end this," Detective Morrison said. "Victoria's campaign against you stops tonight." As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that I hadn't expected. Relief that this nightmare was finally going to end, but sadness for the collateral damage that was about to rain down on my family. My father was going to learn that the woman he loved had tried to murder his daughter. Dylan was going to discover that the stepmother he'd accepted as family was actually a calculating killer. But as I watched the video feed from the kitchen camera, where Victoria was now calmly loading the dishwasher, as if she hadn't just spent 20 minutes preparing poison, I knew that I'd made the only choice possible. Some truths were too dangerous to keep hidden, no matter how much pain they might cause. Victoria thought she'd found the perfect method to eliminate an inconvenient stepdaughter. Instead, she'd provided the evidence that would finally put her behind bars where she belonged. The hunter had become the hunted, and she didn't even know it yet. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the weight of what was about to unfold. I'd barely slept, checking the camera feeds every few minutes throughout the night, watching for any sign that Victoria might be preparing another attempt or disposing of evidence. But she'd gone to bed at her usual time and followed her normal morning routine, apparently confident that her latest poisoning scheme would succeed where the coffee had failed. Detective Morrison called at 7:30, his voice brisk and professional. "We've got a search warrant for the house and an arrest warrant for Victoria. Federal agents from the FBI will be joining us because the use of Thomas Chen to commit the initial poisoning makes this a federal conspiracy case." The FBI. The magnitude of what Victoria had done was finally being recognized at the highest levels of law enforcement. She hadn't just tried to kill me in a moment of anger or desperation. She'd orchestrated a criminal conspiracy that crossed state lines and involved multiple felonies. "When will you execute the warrants?" I asked. "Within the hour. We want to catch Victoria before she has a chance to dispose of evidence or flee. Is your father home?" I checked the camera feeds on my phone, confirming that both my father's and Victoria's cars were in the driveway. "Yes, they're both there. Dad usually leaves for work around 8, but Victoria's schedule is less predictable. We'll move before your father leaves," Detective Morrison said. "I need you to stay exactly where you are until this is over. Don't contact anyone in your family, don't post anything on social media, and don't go anywhere near that house. Victoria is about to realize that her world is collapsing, and desperate people do unpredictable things." After hanging up, I sat on Zoe's couch with my phone in my hands, watching the live feeds from my family's kitchen and bedroom. The mundane morning routine playing out on the screens felt surreal, knowing that it was about to be shattered by federal agents arriving with handcuffs and search warrants. Victoria appeared in the kitchen feed at 8:15, dressed in her typical morning attire of perfectly pressed slacks and a silk blouse. She moved through her routine of making coffee and organizing the day's schedule with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. There was no sign of guilt or anxiety in her demeanor, no indication that she suspected anything was wrong. My father joined her briefly, grabbing a travel mug of coffee and kissing her cheek before heading toward the garage. He looked like any other suburban husband starting another ordinary day, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was a would-be murderer, and his world was about to explode. At 8:43, 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of the house on Maple Avenue. I watched through the camera feed as Victoria froze at the kitchen window, her coffee mug suspended halfway to her lips as she stared at the law enforcement vehicles, disgorging agents in tactical gear. For just a moment, her carefully constructed facade cracked, and I saw something raw and panicked in her expression. Then her training kicked in, and Victoria's face smoothed back into its usual composed mask. She set down her coffee mug with steady hands and walked toward the front door, her posture erect and confident. Even facing arrest, she was going to perform the role of innocent victim until the very end. The doorbell rang, and I watched Victoria pause to check her appearance in the hallway mirror before opening the door. Through the audio pickup on the kitchen camera, I could hear muffled voices, official and authoritative tones explaining warrants and constitutional rights. Victoria's voice came through clearly as she invited the agents inside, her tone perfectly calibrated to convey confusion and cooperation. "Of course, officers, I don't understand what this is about, but please come in. How can I help you?" Detective Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, followed by 2 FBI agents and a crime scene technician carrying evidence collection equipment. Victoria trailed behind them, maintaining her bewildered homeowner act, even as agents began photographing and documenting every surface she'd touched the night before. Mrs. Victoria Hendricks, Detective Morrison said formally, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and solicitation of criminal activity. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning seemed to echo through the house, each phrase carrying the weight of justice finally being served. Victoria's expression never changed, as she was handcuffed, her wrists held behind her back, with the same composed dignity she brought to hosting dinner parties. But I caught something in her eyes as she was led toward the door, a flicker of rage that suggested she knew exactly who was responsible for her downfall. She looked directly toward the camera I'd hidden in the kitchen utensil container, her gaze finding the lens with uncanny accuracy. Her lips moved silently, forming words that the camera's audio couldn't pick up. But I could read them clearly. "You little bitch." The mask was finally off. Within minutes, the house was swarming with federal agents and crime scene technicians, methodically documenting evidence and collecting samples from every surface Victoria had touched. They found the contaminated Chinese food in the refrigerator, the cleaning chemicals she'd used to make her poison, and traces of residue in the garbage disposal where she'd disposed of her mixing cup. More importantly, they found Victoria's laptop and discovered a digital trail that revealed the full scope of her criminal planning. Browser searches for undetectable poisons, household chemicals that cause heart failure, and hiring criminals for odd jobs. Financial records showing payments to Pacific Coast Services, and specifically to Thomas Chen. Draft emails discussing household management problems that needed permanent solutions. The FBI's digital forensics team would later determine that Victoria had been researching methods to kill me for over 8 months, her searches becoming increasingly specific and desperate as her earlier attempts failed to achieve the desired result. My father arrived home 2 hours later to find his house cordoned off with crime scene tape and his wife being loaded into a federal transport van. I watched through the camera feed as Detective Morrison met him in the driveway, explaining the situation with the kind of gentle professionalism that law enforcement uses when delivering life-altering news. Dad's face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before: confusion, disbelief, denial, and finally a kind of hollow shock that made him look decades older. He stood in his own driveway, staring at the house, where he'd thought he was living a normal suburban life, trying to process the fact that the woman he'd married had been systematically attempting to murder his daughter. Dylan came home from school to the same devastating scene, his teenage world crashing down as agents explained that the stepmother who'd helped him with homework and driven him to basketball practice was actually a criminal who'd tried to kill his half-sister. I wanted to go to him, to help him process this impossible reality, but Detective Morrison had been firm about me staying away until the scene was secured. The media arrived by evening, news vans lining Maple Avenue, as reporters breathlessly covered the story of the suburban stepmother, who'd hired a criminal to poison her stepdaughter. Victoria's carefully curated social media presence became evidence in a federal case, her posts about family values and household management taking on sinister new meanings in light of her arrest. The story went national within days. Pine Sol stepmother became a hashtag as people shared their own stories of toxic family relationships and barely survived poisoning attempts. Legal experts analyzed the case on television, marveling at the premeditation and coldness required to hire a stranger to murder your own stepdaughter. Victoria pleaded not guilty, of course. Her defense attorney tried to paint her as a woman, driven to desperation by an ungrateful stepdaughter who disrupted her peaceful home. They claimed the poisoning was an accident, that Victoria had been trying to help Thomas Chen by giving him legitimate work, and had no idea he would use the cleaning job to commit a crime. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video I'd recorded of Victoria preparing poison, the digital trail of her research into murder methods, the financial records linking her to Thomas Chen, and the timeline of suspicious incidents that established a pattern of escalating violence. Thomas Chen himself eventually cooperated with prosecutors, testifying that Victoria had specifically requested him to handle a problem in her household, and had provided detailed instructions about contaminating my coffee. The trial lasted 6 weeks and dominated local news coverage. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through each suspicious incident, on my timeline and explaining how I'd come to realize that my stepmother was trying to kill me. The defense attorney tried to portray me as paranoid and attention-seeking, but the evidence spoke louder than their character assassination attempts. Victoria sat through it all, with the same composed expression she'd worn while planning my murder, occasionally taking notes, but never showing emotion. Her carefully constructed persona held even under the pressure of a federal trial, though I caught glimpses of the rage that burned underneath, when she thought no one was watching. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts, on all counts. Victoria was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, the judge noting that her crimes showed a level of premeditation and callousness that shocks the conscience. Thomas Chen received 15 years, in exchange for his cooperation, a sentence that reflected both his role in the conspiracy and his willingness to testify against Victoria. He'd been desperate for work, and had made a terrible decision, but Victoria had been the architect of the entire scheme. My father never recovered from the betrayal, not really. He sold the house on Maple Avenue, and moved into a small apartment across town, unable to live in a place where his wife had spent months planning his daughter's murder. Our relationship improved in some ways, bonded by shared trauma, and his guilt over not recognizing the danger I'd been in. But he aged rapidly in the months following Victoria's arrest, the weight of his poor judgment, and the loss of the life he'd thought he was building taking a visible toll. Dylan struggled the most with the aftermath. He genuinely loved Victoria, seeing her as the mother he'd never had, and learning that she was capable of such calculated evil shattered his ability to trust his own judgment about people. He moved in with his biological mother in Seattle, and started seeing a therapist who specialized in helping young people process family trauma. As for me, I used the media attention from the trial to launch a nonprofit organization focused on helping victims of domestic poisoning and family violence. The Pine Sol case, as it became known, had highlighted how common these crimes actually were, and how often they went undetected, because the perpetrators were trusted family members. We partnered with toxicologists and law enforcement to develop educational materials about recognizing poisoning symptoms and documenting suspicious incidents. We provided grants for hidden camera equipment to people who suspected family members of trying to harm them. Most importantly, we offered support and resources to people who found themselves in the impossible position of suspecting someone they were supposed to love of trying to kill them. The organization grew rapidly, fueled by donations from people who recognized themselves in my story and wanted to help others who might be facing similar situations. We received hundreds of letters from people who'd experienced suspicious illnesses or unexplained symptoms, many of them discovering patterns of abuse they'd never recognized before. One letter in particular stayed with me, from a woman in Ohio whose husband had been slowly poisoning her with antifreeze in her morning orange juice. She'd attributed her symptoms to stress and overwork until she saw my case on the news and realized that someone who claimed to love her might actually be trying to kill her. With our help, she gathered evidence and got her husband arrested, probably saving her own life in the process. 3 years after Victoria's arrest, I moved to Seattle to be closer to Dylan and to open a West Coast branch of our organization. My half-brother was doing better, though he still struggled with trust issues and had decided to delay college while he continued therapy. We met for coffee every week, slowly rebuilding our relationship and helping each other process the shared trauma of discovering that someone we'd lived with and trusted had been a calculating predator. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't figured it out? Dylan asked me one afternoon, as we sat in a coffee shop near the University of Washington. He was 20 now, taller than our father, and bearing an unfortunate resemblance to Victoria that made our meetings occasionally awkward. I try not to think about it, I said honestly. But yeah, sometimes I do. She would have kept trying until she succeeded, and then probably found a way to make it look like an accident or suicide. And then what? She just goes on with her life, like nothing happened. That's exactly what she would have done, I said. Victoria's a sociopath. We weren't real people to her, just obstacles to be managed or eliminated. If she'd succeeded in killing me, she would have comforted Dad through his grief and moved on to whatever the next problem was. Dylan shuddered, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug, as if the warmth could chase away the chill of contemplating Victoria's true nature. I still can't believe I lived with her for 3 years and never saw it. She was very good at hiding it, I said. That's what made her so dangerous. If she'd been obviously unstable or violent, we would have recognized the threat. But she was patient and methodical and completely convincing in her role as concerned stepmother. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching college students hurry past the window with their laptops and coffee cups, oblivious to the darker realities that could lurk behind suburban facades and family dinner tables. "I'm proud of you," Dylan said suddenly, "for fighting back, for not just running away when you realized what was happening. You probably saved other people's lives by getting her arrested." "I'm proud of you too," I replied, "for dealing with this with such grace, for not letting it destroy your ability to trust people completely." My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe, now my business partner, and still my closest friend. "Media interview at 4, remember? Channel 8 wants to discuss the new legislation about domestic poisoning cases." I showed Dylan the message, and he smiled. "Look at you, becoming a professional victim advocate. Victoria probably never imagined that trying to kill you would launch your career in helping other people. Ironic, isn't it?" I said, standing up to gather my things. "She wanted to erase me from existence, and instead she gave me a platform to help other victims find their voices." As I walked back to my car, I thought about the letter I'd received the week before, from a woman in Texas, whose mother-in-law had been putting bleach in her vitamins. Thanks to our organization's resources and support, she'd gathered evidence and gotten the woman arrested before suffering permanent damage. That was Victoria's true legacy, not the careful facade she'd constructed, or the perfect family image she'd tried to maintain. Her attempt to murder me had exposed her completely and created a network of support for other victims who might otherwise have suffered in silence. She was spending the rest of her life in federal prison, her reputation destroyed, and her freedom gone forever. Meanwhile, I was building something meaningful from the wreckage of our family, turning her cruelty into a force for protection and justice. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, especially when your life becomes dedicated to making sure other people survive the monsters in their own families. Victoria had tried to erase me from her perfect world, but instead she'd given me the most important work of my life. I'd never thank her for it, but I'd never stop using the platform her crimes had created to help other people recognize the warning signs and fight back before it was too late. The pine-scented poison that was supposed to kill me had instead launched a movement, and that felt like justice in its purest form. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.